Something inside you has been quietly unraveling, even if your life on the surface still looks intact. There is a subtle tension you carry, a feeling that things are slightly out of place, as if you are moving through your days without truly touching them. It is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it appears as a low, persistent restlessness, a quiet doubt that follows you even in moments that should feel complete. And in the middle of that inner noise, you may have wondered if you are disconnected, if something essential has slipped beyond your reach. But what if the chaos you feel is not a sign of disconnection, but a signal of misalignment within your own internal field? What if the universe has not gone silent, but your system has become too saturated to perceive its responses? Many people believe they are waiting for something external to change, a sign, an opportunity, a breakthrough. Yet beneath that waiting, there is often a deeper truth. The internal state from which they are observing life has not shifted, and so the patterns they encounter continue to mirror the same emotional and cognitive frequency. Your mind, your body, and your emotional patterns form a kind of internal environment, a living field that constantly interacts with what you experience as reality. When that field is fragmented, when your thoughts say one thing but your emotions echo another, you create a form of internal interference. It becomes difficult to perceive clarity, not because it is absent, but because it cannot pass cleanly through a system that is in conflict with itself. This is where many people begin to feel lost, not because they are alone, but because they are out of resonance with their own signal. The idea of a quantum connection with the universe is often misunderstood as something distant or mystical, something that requires special knowledge or extraordinary experiences. In reality, it begins much closer, within the subtle coherence of your internal state. When your thoughts, emotions, and physical responses begin to align, something changes in the way you perceive, interpret, and respond to life. It is not that the universe suddenly starts speaking louder. It is that you begin to hear what was always there. This is not about forcing positivity or denying the presence of fear, doubt, or uncertainty. It is about understanding how these states influence the way you engage with reality and how they shape the patterns that return to you. The chaos you feel may be the result of a system that has been conditioned by repetition, by past experiences that continue to define your present reactions. And until that internal pattern is recognized and reorganized, the external world will often seem to repeat itself in ways that feel frustrating and inexplicable. So the real question is not whether the universe is responding to you. The real question is, from which internal state are you sending your signal? You are not broken. You are repeating a signal. There is a quiet pattern that unfolds beneath your daily life, one that rarely calls attention to itself, yet shapes almost everything you experience. It is not defined by what you say you want, but by what you continuously feel, expect, and anticipate without noticing. Many people assume that change begins with intention, with a clear decision to want something different. But intention alone does not reorganize the deeper layers of the mind and body. What truly directs your experience is the signal you repeat, often unconsciously, through your emotional and physiological state. When your system becomes overloaded with tension, uncertainty, or subtle fear, it begins to interpret reality through that lens. This does not happen in a dramatic or obvious way. It happens in small distortions, in how you perceive opportunities, in how you respond to silence, in how quickly your thoughts return to doubt. Over time, these micro-patterns accumulate and create a stable internal environment that feels familiar, even if it is uncomfortable. The body learns this pattern and begins to reproduce it automatically, reinforcing the same internal state, regardless of external circumstances. This is where the sense of chaos often intensifies. Not because life is inherently disordered, but because the internal signal you are emitting is fragmented. You may think about peace, but feel urgency. You may desire clarity, but carry tension. You may imagine abundance, yet remain emotionally anchored in scarcity. This internal contradiction generates noise, and that noise interferes with your ability to perceive subtle changes, insights, or shifts that are already present. The mind, in this state, becomes hyper-focused on confirmation. It searches for evidence that reinforces what it already feels. If the underlying emotion is anxiety, the mind scans for threats, for delays, for signs that something is not working. This selective attention strengthens the pattern, creating a loop in which your perception continues to validate your internal state. The more this loop repeats, the more convincing it becomes, until it feels as though reality itself is fixed in that pattern. At the same time, the body plays a crucial role in maintaining this signal. Emotional states are not abstract. They are biochemical processes that influence your nervous system, your breathing, your posture, and your level of tension. When a particular emotional state is repeated often enough, the body begins to expect it. It becomes familiar with that chemistry and starts to recreate it, even in the absence of external triggers. This is why certain feelings seem to return without a clear cause. They are not being triggered, they are being reproduced. In this condition, trying to connect with something greater, something more expansive, becomes difficult, not because that connection is unavailable, but because the internal environment is too unstable to sustain it. It is similar to trying to detect a subtle signal through static. The signal exists, but it cannot be clearly perceived until the interference is reduced. This is why moments of stillness, clarity, or insight often feel rare or fleeting when your internal state is dominated by noise. The idea that you are disconnected can become a belief reinforced by this experience. You may begin to assume that something is missing, that others have access to something you do not. But what is often happening is far less dramatic and far more precise. The system you are using to perceive and interpret reality is conditioned by repetition, and until that repetition changes, the experience remains consistent. When you begin to understand this, a different perspective emerges. The focus shifts from trying to control external outcomes to recognizing the pattern that is continuously being broadcast from within. This recognition is not immediate transformation, but it is the first moment in which the loop becomes visible. And once something becomes visible, it is no longer entirely automatic. Your frequency is not what you say, it is what you sustain. There is a subtle misunderstanding that shapes the way most people approach transformation, and it begins with the belief that change can be initiated through isolated moments of intention. A thought repeated for a few minutes, a feeling briefly invoked, or a vision imagined in a quiet moment is often treated as sufficient to alter the course of reality. Yet beneath these efforts, there exists a deeper layer that does not respond to what is occasional, but to what is consistent. Your frequency is not defined by what you declare in moments of clarity, but by what you sustain across time without interruption. The human system is designed to adapt through repetition. Thoughts that are revisited frequently begin to form neural pathways. Emotional states that are experienced repeatedly become familiar patterns, and the body learns to anticipate and recreate those patterns with increasing efficiency. Over time, this process forms a stable internal baseline, a kind of emotional identity that influences perception, behavior, and expectation. This baseline does not shift because of isolated efforts. It shifts when a new pattern is sustained long enough to replace the old one. This is why many attempts to change feel ineffective. There is often a gap between what is consciously desired and what is unconsciously maintained. A person may speak about abundance, yet internally operate from a state of vigilance, always scanning for loss or instability. They may imagine peace, yet carry a constant sense of urgency in their body, as if something is always about to go wrong. These contradictions are not failures of intention, but reflections of a deeper pattern that has not yet been reorganized. Within this context, the concept of frequency becomes more precise. It is not an abstract or mystical idea, but a measurable consistency in the way thoughts, emotions, and physiological responses align over time. When these elements are coherent, the internal signal becomes stable. When they are fragmented, the signal becomes distorted. The universe, in this sense, does not respond to isolated declarations, but to the dominant pattern that is being expressed continuously. Modern environments further complicate this process. The constant availability of stimulation, information, and rapid feedback creates a system that is conditioned to seek immediate results. Attention becomes fragmented, and the ability to remain present with a single internal state weakens. This fragmentation makes it difficult to sustain a new pattern long enough for it to become the new baseline. Instead, the system oscillates between brief moments of clarity and longer periods of automatic repetition. There is also an internal resistance that often goes unnoticed. The familiar, even when uncomfortable, provides a sense of predictability. The unknown, even when desirable, introduces uncertainty. This creates a subtle tension within the system, where part of the mind seeks change, while another part maintains the existing pattern for the sake of stability. This tension can slow or even prevent the integration of a new frequency, not because change is impossible, but because the system is attempting to protect itself from unpredictability. As this dynamic unfolds, it becomes clear that transformation is not a sudden event, but a gradual reorganization. The old patterns do not disappear instantly. They weaken as new patterns are sustained with greater consistency. This process requires a form of internal continuity, a willingness to remain aligned with a new state even when external confirmation has not yet appeared. Without this continuity, the system tends to revert to what is familiar, reinforcing the belief that nothing has changed. Over time, however, something begins to shift. The new pattern, once fragile, becomes more stable. The body begins to recognize it as familiar. The mind starts to interpret reality through a different lens. What once required effort becomes more natural, and the internal signal becomes clearer. It is within this clarity that subtle changes in perception and experience begin to emerge, not as sudden miracles, but as quiet adjustments that gradually reshape the way life is encountered. The universe does not always answer by giving. Sometimes it answers by removing. There is a moment in every deep internal shift when life begins to reorganize itself in ways that do not immediately feel like progress. The expectation is often that alignment will bring clarity, expansion, and visible improvement in a direct and reassuring form. Yet what frequently emerges instead is a subtle unraveling, a quiet disintegration of patterns, relationships, or structures that once felt stable. This phase can be confusing, even unsettling, because it does not match the image most people hold of growth. It feels less like receiving and more like losing. What is often overlooked is that coherence within the internal field changes the way the system interacts with what is incompatible. When your frequency begins to stabilize in a new pattern, elements that were previously tolerated may no longer resonate in the same way. This is not an act of rejection, but a natural consequence of alignment. The body, the mind, and the emotional system begin to register dissonance more clearly, and what once felt normal may now feel heavy, restrictive, or out of place. This shift does not always occur through conscious decision. It can appear as a gradual distancing, a loss of interest, or a quiet discomfort that makes it difficult to remain engaged in certain dynamics. In other cases, it manifests through external changes that seem abrupt or unexpected. Situations dissolve, connections weaken, and familiar environments begin to lose their sense of continuity. From a limited perspective, this can be interpreted as disruption or instability. From a broader perspective, it is a form of reorganization. The mind often resists this process because it is conditioned to equate stability with safety. When something familiar begins to fade, even if it is no longer aligned, the system can interpret it as a threat. This triggers a tendency to hold on, to try to restore what is changing, or to question whether something has gone wrong. In reality, what is being experienced is a transition between patterns, a movement from one internal coherence to another. There is also a deeper symbolic layer to this experience. What appears as external change is often a reflection of internal integration. Patterns that were once unconscious begin to surface, and as they are recognized, they lose their automatic influence. This can create a temporary sense of disorientation as the old structure dissolves before the new one fully stabilizes. It is within this space that many people feel most uncertain, not because they are lost, but because they are no longer anchored to what they once were. In this phase, responses from the environment may not be immediately visible in the form of gain or expansion. Instead, they appear as subtle shifts in perception, as moments of clarity, as a heightened sensitivity to what aligns and what does not. Coincidences may begin to feel more meaningful, not because they are extraordinary, but because they are perceived differently. The signal that once felt distant becomes more accessible, not through force, but through reduced interference. There is a paradox within this process. As the internal field becomes more coherent, the need for external validation often decreases. The system begins to rely less on immediate confirmation and more on an internal sense of alignment. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it changes the way uncertainty is experienced. It becomes less of a threat and more of a space in which new patterns can emerge. What is removed during this phase is not arbitrary. It is often what no longer matches the direction of the new internal signal. This can include beliefs, habits, emotional responses, and even aspects of identity that were built around previous experiences. The removal is not always comfortable, but it creates space. And within that space, something quieter and more stable begins to take form, something that does not depend on repetition of the past, but on the coherence of what is being sustained now. Coherence is quiet, but it changes everything. There is a point in this process where the external world does not appear dramatically different, yet something fundamental has shifted in the way it is experienced. The same environments, the same people, and the same routines may still be present, but the internal response to them begins to change. This shift is not loud or performative. It does not announce itself with intensity or urgency. Instead, it unfolds with a kind of quiet precision, as if the system has begun to recalibrate itself from within. What defines this stage is coherence, not as an abstract idea, but as a consistent alignment between thought, emotion, and physiological state. When these elements begin to synchronize, the internal signal stabilizes. The mind no longer oscillates as rapidly between conflicting interpretations, and the body reduces its tendency to anticipate threat in neutral situations. This creates a space in which perception becomes clearer, not because reality has changed, but because the distortion has decreased. In this state, responses from the environment are often subtle. They do not always appear as immediate outcomes or visible transformations. Instead, they emerge as shifts in timing, in decision-making, in the ability to notice what was previously overlooked. Opportunities that once seemed hidden begin to appear, not as new creations, but as elements that were always present but not previously perceived. This change in perception alters the way choices are made, and over time, those choices begin to influence the direction of experience. The relationship with uncertainty also evolves. Previously, uncertainty may have triggered a need for control, a tendency to predict, to anticipate, or to seek reassurance. As coherence increases, uncertainty becomes less charged. It does not disappear, but it loses its intensity. The system becomes more capable of remaining stable without immediate resolution. This stability allows for a different kind of interaction with the unknown, one that is less reactive and more responsive. There is also a noticeable reduction in internal friction. The constant negotiation between conflicting desires, fears, and expectations begins to ease. This does not mean that all conflict disappears, but it becomes less dominant. Decisions are made with greater clarity, not because there are no alternatives, but because the internal signal is less divided. This clarity does not guarantee immediate results, but it changes the quality of engagement with each situation. As this process continues, the need to constantly evaluate progress begins to diminish. The focus shifts away from monitoring external outcomes and toward maintaining internal consistency. This shift is significant because it alters the feedback loop that previously reinforced old patterns. Instead of reacting to external validation or lack of it, the system begins to reference its own state as a point of stability. This reduces the tendency to revert to previous patterns when results are not immediately visible. There is a simplicity in this stage that can be easily overlooked. It does not rely on complex techniques or intense effort. It is sustained through continuity, through the repetition of a coherent state that gradually becomes more familiar than the old patterns. Over time, this familiarity strengthens, and the new state requires less conscious maintenance. What once felt deliberate begins to feel natural. This is where the interaction with what is often described as the universe becomes more apparent. Not as a separate force acting from a distance, but as a reflection of the coherence that is being maintained. The external world begins to mirror this stability in subtle ways, through smoother transitions, through fewer disruptions, and through a sense of alignment that does not need to be explained. It is not that everything becomes predictable, but that the relationship with what unfolds becomes less resistant. In this quiet transformation, the most significant changes are often the least visible. They are found in the absence of previous reactions, in the ease of decisions that once felt difficult, and in the ability to remain present without the constant pull of past patterns. Coherence, in this sense, does not demand attention, but it reshapes the entire experience from within. What once felt like chaos begins to reveal a different meaning when you see it from a deeper perspective. It was never just random noise or a sign that something was broken. It was a reflection of an internal field that had been shaped by repetition, by patterns that continued to operate beneath awareness. When those patterns start to shift, even slightly, the experience of reality changes with them. Not all at once, not in dramatic ways, but in the subtle reorganization of perception, response, and presence. The connection with the universe was never absent. It was simply obscured by the interference of a fragmented signal. As coherence begins to stabilize, what once felt distant becomes perceptible, not as a voice or a sign that demands attention, but as a quiet alignment that makes decisions clearer, timing more fluid, and reactions less driven by the past. This is not about controlling outcomes or forcing change. It is about sustaining a state that allows change to emerge naturally. There is a shift from seeking to noticing, from forcing to allowing, from reacting to responding. And in that shift, something becomes evident. The answers you were waiting for were never withheld. They were waiting for a system that could receive them without distortion. Now consider this. If your experience is shaped by the signal you sustain, what kind of reality are you reinforcing every single day without even realizing it? And more importantly, what begins to change when that signal finally becomes coherent? If this perspective resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and stay connected to this kind of depth and clarity. Continue watching the next video on your screen, because this is where the understanding expands and begins to take a more precise form in your experience.